it will be. All right. Hello, my name is Navin Ramlingam. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Inequality for Volume 39. This is a first in a series of Zoom interviews the journal is planning to facilitate with the faculty, practitioners, and other legal experts about a variety of issues affecting law and inequality during COVID-19. This is a series for our online journal, Inequality Inquiry. With me is Abby, the incoming executive editor for JLI. Our topic today is domestic violence and other gender-related issues in the time of COVID-19. We have a very special guest with us today to kick off the series off to a great start. Professor June Carbone is the faculty advisor for the Journal of Law and Inequality and also the inaugural holder of a Rabina Chair in Law, Science and Technology here at the University of Minnesota Law School. Professor Carbone has taught at University of Missouri at Kansas City, at Santa Clara University School of Law, and was a visiting scholar at Stanford University's Institute for Research in Women and Gender. Professor Carbone writes prolifically on law and the family, marriage, divorce, and domestic obligations, including changes brought about by the technology revolution. Most recent books are Red Families versus Blue Families, Legal Polarization and the Creation of Culture, which explores the effects of diverging values and norms in America, and Marriage Markets, How Inequality is Remaking the American Family, which examines the widening class divide in the American family. Professor Carbone, welcome. It's an honor to have you with us today. We are going to be talking about serious issues of domestic violence today, so a trigger warning is required. Survivors of domestic and sexual abuse can receive free and confidential support at all hours by calling 1-800-848-5991. For Spanish, please call 1-866-728-2131. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline via text or call at 1-800-799-7233. All right. Moving on to the interview portion, Professor Carbone, we know and join many students here at the University of Minnesota Law School who have expressed admiration and gratitude to our faculty members who are facing all the same personal pressures of family, health, and life demands created by COVID-19 as the rest of us, but also had just a few days to convert the entire law school courses to digital format.
Yeah.
How are you doing during all of these changes?
Well, I must say they're a bit overwhelming. And the questions you asked really caused me to reflect on my own adjustment to all of this. And it really is remarkable to think back. So spring break happened. We had longstanding plans to visit our son in San Francisco, who has recently taken in 2 foster children. And we felt, you know, we hadn't been there. He had said he didn't want visits the first few months to give the children time to adjust. And so we were very excited about this trip and should we go? And we did go. We had a wonderful time. But the first the first Airbnb we had rented canceled on us, citing coronavirus fears. We were taken aback. You know, our view was, we're visiting San Francisco from Minnesota. We should be afraid of them. We went out there. You know, as we started worrying about would we get home, and we were flying to Kansas City now. They, in fact, canceled our flight the day of the flight. But it turned out, at least as far as we know, not to be coronavirus related. We got to Kansas City. We were with our children, our other children, and our grandchildren, and they were being careful. But we went out to a restaurant which was half empty. By the end of the week, we were very happy to be coming home, and then we got the announcement from the law school. They canceled classes for Monday and Tuesday, and we would be adjusting to online education on Wednesday. And it was a feeling of, oh my God. Both that it's affecting us in a way that I think the day we left for California, we still thought of it as very far away. And by the time we came back on March 15th, we thought it's here and it's real. And I wonder if we've been exposed. And now that we've been back home and, you know, sheltering in place, we feel pretty confident we weren't exposed in California or Kansas City. And that question now, I think, on everyone's mind is, how long is this going to last? Faculty meeting today talking about plans, and the questions were, well, do we have plans for the fall? And the answer is, we don't know. And the university hasn't made any final decisions. It's very hard to know what's going to happen. So I would say, my response continues to be one of, this is still unfolding. And I don't think we're in a position to understand the full dimensions or long-term consequences.
How is your transition to online education, online teaching has been?
Yes, well, I'm surprised at how well it's gone. I have resisted PowerPoint in my classes for years, in large part because, well, partly because I like the spontaneity. But the other reason is, when I have used them, I have spent the first 2 weeks of the semester walking in and having the computer system not work for a different reason every day. And so I had a sense of terror. I'm going to get there. I'm going to press all the right buttons and nothing's going to happen. And now I feel pretty comfortable with it. When I went into the faculty meeting today, I had to go through about 3 or 4 more steps to enter the faculty meeting. The security was considerably higher than the security for my class. Mm-hmm. Quite startled at how long it took me to get in. That said, I have been incredibly impressed with the student response. Students have been very supportive. I think they have been very engaged. They've been concerned about each other when there have been issues, and they've given me a lot more feedback than they normally do on whether what I'm doing is working. So I really have appreciated that, and found I found Zoom more intuitive than I expected. Perhaps because I know how to turn on my own computer.
Excellent. Thank you.
So I hope you all are doing all right.
Yeah, so far so good.
Yeah. Our biggest concern is we have no idea how you're doing. I have some idea when students don't show up in class and when they come in and look depressed or exhausted. I have no idea what's going on online.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard to tell. So, Professor, you are an expert in family law, assisted reproduction, property law, medicine, and bioethics. You've taught a variety of courses from contracts remedies to financial institutions and feminist jurisprudence. And you'll be teaching family law and gender theory and law this fall. So are you planning on updating any of the material due to the ongoing pandemic or any ongoing changes to those areas of law? And if so, what would that look like?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the gender course, I last taught it a number of years ago, and I do that. In fact, I don't yet have a syllabus up because it changes hourly. And, when I last taught it, it was course designed, I mean, the course itself was designed 20 years ago or more. And the critical issue in framing gender issues, I mean, I always start with definition of feminist jurisprudence as asking the woman question. How do issues in society we think of as neutral, how do they affect women? And then the question, are women's challenges to be able to compete on the same terms, or to have the workplace adjust and society adjust to different terms? Today, and as I said, this does change hourly my views on this. I don't think that's the question at all. I think what you have is a system out there that is increasingly out of whack and unjust for reasons that go well beyond women's concerns. And I think the question of how that interacts with women's concerns requires a redefinition of what gender is about. And gender at one time, when I started in this business, mapped on to the question of are women treated differently. And today, I think the question, what is gender? And what are the constructs embedded in society? And do they have anything to do with men and women per se? So to give you an example, I think what has happened in almost all aspects of society is that competition has become more intense in ways that make the system easier to rig. And whether that rigging is intentional. I've got a whole, one of the things I'm proudest of is some recent work I've been doing that re-examines the Walmart case that went to the Supreme Court in 2011. Does and lost 5-4 on a question of certifying the class. Today, what I would say about that case is almost everything in the case that disadvantages women facilitates wage theft. Walmart is #1 in the country in wages and hours violations. It has been fined over $1 billion since 2000. It is double the fines with the second next company in wages and hours violations. Virtually everything about that case facilitates wage theft. And the people whose wages are being stolen at Walmart's, that is, denied violation of the wages and hours protections, over 70% of the hourly workers are women. Now, is this about gender? If it's about gender, it's about selection of a managerial force that responds to bonuses dangled in front of them like dog whistles, and a lack of empathy and concern about employees. And those are gender characteristics, but they are not limited to men. You can find women who buy into the system, but they are very deliberately manipulated in a way that gives you a desired result without accountability. Is that a gender system? It does disproportionately to hiring male supervisors and female hourly employees. But the selection is not for men versus women as much as it is the use of competition for bonuses to select managers who will be callous. And that does correspond, both the competitive part and the callousness part corresponds to gender stereotypes that do not map one-on-one onto men and women. That's what I think the course is going to be about, is re-examining how those characteristics influence the workplace, escape scrutiny under traditional employment discrimination law, affect our politics, and are deeply embedded in what has been conservative political strategy that activates biases associated with traditional values and hierarchy in a way that disadvantages what are called women's issues, but are not necessarily directly about men versus women per se. So that course I am redesigning. And when you get into an era of disruption, and I don't care whether it's technological disruption in startups or coronavirus disruption, there's no question that disruption itself has a series of gendered effects, creating opportunities for those with, we call it hubris and narcissism, and disadvantaging people in positions of less power. So being able to break the rules and get away with it increases dramatically in a system that is being disrupted.
This is fascinating because earlier today I saw an advertisement for a new television show called Mrs. America. This is going to be on Showtime, and it's about the ratification of ERA, when the atomic difference, in the early 1970s, along with the second wave feminism, and the surprising backlash, the conservative backlash, spearheaded by Phyllis Schlafly.
Yeah.
She's played by Kate Blanchett, and there's also other parallel stories like the presidential run by Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, and all those. And given the importance of the 100th year, the centennial celebration, the 19th Amendment, and I was just thinking about that in terms of what happened in 2018 with the Me Too era, and how your course would play into the tackling that, and with the COVID situation. And do you envision, beyond, what you had planned for, tackling Me Too era, there are also other issues that are going to be raised by COVID? There are certain fault lines in society along gender and racial lines that have been laid bare by this global pandemic. And how do you see you engaging with your students on those particular issues?
Well, and that's where, you know, that's the next round. So having laid that as a background, then in property, I mean, one of the areas I'm you know, and we had mostly done landlord-tenant by the time COVID really took hold. But what's happening in landlord-tenant situations is tenants don't have the money to pay. They don't pay. Landlord can't make repairs. Either they're evicting people who in the pandemic have no place to go, or they are not making repairs and allowing properties to deteriorate. And in that process, all of the kinds of social fault lines in society get worse. Who's going to get a bailout? Who isn't? What you had in the financial crisis is a very cynical bailout of the wealthiest people in the country, the people who are responsible for the financial crisis. And I view it as a big lie. The big lie is that the financial crisis is the result of, you know, back in whatever, is the result of people borrowing money you know, they got greedy. They wanted to buy a house and they borrowed money they couldn't afford. They lied on loan applications. They fell behind in mortgage payments because they bought a house that was too big for them, and they shouldn't be bailed out because it's their fault. And if you go back, my husband is working with a documentarian on this, and this is something I built into the property class this year, is a documentary that goes back and looks at the financial crisis and shows how predatory lending that targeted the most vulnerable people was a major source of crisis. And then that was used to justify bailing out the bankers as though they were the victims and not the real victims, particularly people in minority communities where predatory lending practices came at the tail end of the mortgage bubble. And these are the communities whose housing stock has been the slowest to recover. Well, what I think you see about to take place now, and you know, landlord-tenant law is on the cutting edge of this, is again a system that provides no bailouts, limited protection for the most vulnerable in a way that increases the concentration and spread of the virus. That's going on in Detroit right now. New York is so complicated. I think the level of what's taking place in New York is a whole different level of magnitude, but the inequalities in New York are there as well. And so that question of the issue of how the disease spreads, I don't think we have a picture of the way in which poor communities are more vulnerable yet. I think what we have emerging is prisons, the people who have to work in the front lines. I will tell you, and this fits nicely in my gender course, is when you look at women's income, women's income correlates much more strongly with a terminal degree than men's income, because men are much more likely to have high incomes, you know, if they become entrepreneurs. Women are much more likely to have higher incomes by having secure jobs and getting another degree. Well, who are these folks? These are healthcare workers. Okay, healthcare workers, and there's been an entire expansion of the intermediate healthcare positions, physicians, assistants as opposed to doctors. Nurses are no longer a single kind of position, but a lot of specialized roles, physical therapists, speech therapists. These are heavily female dominant positions. Many of them have been real opportunities into the middle class for minority women. They depend on additional degrees and therefore on student loan debt. And what's happening with the virus is a lot of women, especially minority women, are on the front lines in hospitals. When you go down a notch, on the front lines at Walmarts and in, you know, in supermarkets, although obviously lots of men work there too. But the student loan debt that is necessary to get the better jobs, the jobs like physicians, assistants, the masters you need to advance in education, social workers, those jobs are either on the front lines or they're being suspended. The income is being suspended, lots of layoffs, and the student loan debt in those circumstances becomes crushing. But I don't even see that being addressed directly. I see the healthcare workers who are on the front lines are getting sick, at risk of losing custody. I see that being addressed. I don't yet see the economic piece of it, with things like the failure to suspend student loan debt yet becoming a pressing issue.
Thanks. And another thing that we've seen happening as this pandemic sort of unfolds is that there are stats that show, and there's a New York Times article about it as well, that domestic abuse has been rising. So experts have cited two movement restrictions aimed to stop the spread of the virus that may be making the violence more frequent, more severe, and more dangerous. Sociologists who studied abusive relationships say domestic violence goes up whenever families spend more time together. So that happens like during Christmas and during the holidays as well, and during summer vacations. But at the same time, they say these movement restrictions are required. So how do lawmakers and public policy experts balance and take these potential downfalls into account?
I think that's going to be tough. And the first thing to note is that it's not just spending more time together. When you look at the last financial crisis, you also had an increase in domestic violence. Whenever you see a change in status that is threatening, you see an increase in domestic violence. Indeed, you mentioned Phyllis Schlafly, and I think if you go back and look at the ERA and you look at the status threat, a status threat to men, but status threat to religious and traditional families as well that came from the women's movement, I think that explains some of the beginnings of political polarization in the United States. When you look at the financial crisis, you see the same thing. Everything you said about an increase in domestic violence occurred then as well without the confinement. But you had an increase in layoffs, which tends to increase substance abuse. It also tends to increase the time couples spend together in the home. If either one of them is working less, they're in the home more. When you look at studies of how men and women respond to that, women tend to respond to it by investing more in homemaking and more in the status, which is a positive status they receive as homemakers and caretakers. Men who are laid off tend to do less in the home. They help out less in the home, and they drink more than men who are working full-time, even though they have less time. And that tends to be a risk factor. So you have that taking place as a result of financial pressures already. Then you get, and you know, one of the things that's interesting, I taught today a case that involved a custody dispute between a couple who had been raised as members of the Hasidic community in Brooklyn and entered an arranged marriage at 19, and the wife realized over the course of the marriage that she was a lesbian. And, you know, she described going to a therapist and saying she didn't love her husband. He said, "How do you know what love is?" And she described her feelings for another woman when she was in high school. And he said, "Did you think you might be a lesbian?" And she said, "What's a lesbian?" And in reading the case and reading the description of their relationship, you know, and this awakening that occurs when she's in her early 20s, the thing that's striking is, how did this marriage work at all? Well, the husband left early in the morning. He went to work. He came back about the time the children went to sleep. At 19, she defined her role entirely in terms of homemaking, which she did with very little involvement from the husband. After their divorce, he remarried, another arranged marriage within a few months, and exercised less visitation with the children than that to which he was entitled. He had almost no involvement in either marriage in caretaking directly. And the custody dispute arose when he disapproved of her new lifestyle. But I describe that because what was so striking about it is the couple spent very little time together. And if you think about traditional marriages, I mean, my parents had a very good marriage and they married in their 30s, but my father went off to work in the morning and came home at dinner time and didn't spend, I mean, my parents did not spend a lot of time together except on organized social events, you know, and they didn't go out that much. So in contrast, my husband and I spend an enormous amount of time together. And that was before the coronavirus. And now we spend all of our time together. But we live in a big house and we've been together for over 40 years. So it's not terribly stressful. So if you start with that model, that the traditional gender model does not require companionship, now you add the changes in the modern era. And so the modern era, what big part of what's changed is for middle-class couples, for most of the students in law school, you want somebody who will be your best friend before you commit. But for lots of working class couples, they're together because they got pregnant. That used to be true. I mean, courtship in the 50s and 60s, the pregnancy came first. And then they got married. And then when they fought, you know, they hung out with their separate relatives or his drinking buddies, and they just didn't spend a whole lot of time together. Well, that's still true for working class couples today. They're often together because they got pregnant. And they didn't know each other all that well when the relationship started. And they don't necessarily have a lot in common except children. And if you see that pattern of a couple where they weren't best friends when they got together, and they're certainly not best friends now, and all of a sudden you take away the outside involvement. Hey, I know a lot of couples, including my kids, who all of a sudden are home 24/7 with their children when they're used to being lawyers during the daytime. That's tough. But with couples that didn't know each other as well, and there are children present, and they're used to having a stable income, and that's gone, the stresses are absolutely off the charts. I could go on about housing.
Yeah, Professor, I get a sense from your answers. There seems to be a common thread that all these issues, either domestic violence related or gender related issues like wage disparity, these go beyond the pandemic, obviously, and there seems to be institutional problems that seem to either amplify these problems or put certain vulnerable population at more risk. And as we see during this pandemic, institutions that are supposed to protect women from domestic violence, many weak and underfunded to begin with, are now straining to respond to this increased demand. Do you see the pandemic as an opportunity to highlight for the public at large some of the issues that need to be addressed through either revising or creating new laws governing our handling of domestic violence? In short, what can we get right after this pandemic, especially for victims of domestic violence?
Yes, and let me emphasize, I mean, I can be concrete, and one of the things I think the pandemic is highlighting is the difference between, first of all, theory, I'm engaged in lots of theory, and political pontificating. I don't need to point fingers, you can do that yourself. And people are actually solving problems. So if I were to solve problems, I think you need facts, social science in this case, as opposed to biological science, but I think you need social science data. And right now, what I saw in thinking about this podcast was, okay, let's take a look at what is increasing and what's not. So calls to hotlines are increasing. And there is a proposal for additional money as part of the coronavirus response for hotlines. I think that's absolutely critical. People need somewhere to call. Police departments, who are often the frontline responders on domestic, many police departments are not reporting increases. Why not? Well, calling the police is a big thing. So if you call the police and the police come and they arrest the alleged abuser, what happens next? Well, you don't want the alleged abuser to go to jail, because if they go to jail, they're more likely to be exposed to coronavirus. And if they then come home and are reunited with the family, you're worse off. Not to mention the fact that beating somebody up is likely to increase after a call to the police. Where could they go instead of jail? So again, you don't have to have, again, police departments vary in terms of mandatory arrest in response to this, but let's assume the person is not necessarily going to end up in jail. You have to ask the question, where can they go? If they don't have someplace else to go, then triggering the departure of the partner in response not to a long-term plan, but in turn to a specific incident that then cycles out of control. That can be scary too, because, you know, where are they going to go? They might go to another relative. That might not be a good thing. They might have a hard time finding someplace else. And then you get to the question, well, what are the alternatives? So if we have two people and they're both working, which is true for lots of working class families, have they both lost their jobs? Has one of them lost their job? Is one sheltering at home and going out part-time? Well, if the person who is reporting the violence has lost that person's job and they want to leave, how are they going to finance it? Now you need access to a shelter. Shelters are reporting different things in different places. This is not one size fits all for the entire country. So many shelters have individual units, and if you go to a shelter for temporary housing, there often is space available and you can shelter in place with your children. In some places, the shelters are overwhelmed. They're filled to capacity. In some places, and indeed particularly in rural areas, you don't necessarily have individual units that allow you to shelter in a way that is, you know, protects you from coronavirus transmission. So those become more complicated factors. The single biggest nationwide need for which money helps is increasing the domestic violence hotlines. But the regional response in terms of whether you need additional police resources and whether the police should go to this as opposed to any number of other things the police are dealing with right now, that's a tough question. Again, shelter space is critical for poor women to have someplace to go, but that varies by locale, how important that need is in comparison with other needs. So again, you need more information to be able to design an effective policy response. And I would say ears on the ground to what is taking place. But there's no question that there are areas where this is an acute need, and there's no question the incidence of domestic violence will increase.
So kind of along those lines, in addition to intimate partner violence, there have also been concerns raised about child abuse. So in jurisdictions everywhere, the chief worries that not only could coronavirus tensions trigger more abuse, but that with kids out of school, more cases could go unreported. So Minnesota's seen a 30% drop in reports. Do you have any comment on that aspect of the crisis or what could be done about it?
Sure. Now, in terms of reports, one of the things is the reports are often done by professionals who are compelled to report if they've become aware of it. And right now, children aren't in school. So teachers who might be reporting things that are required by law often to report indications of abuse, the teachers aren't seeing the children and they're unlikely to find out about it, you know, if they're using Zoom or using remote homework sessions. Doctor's visits are down. I mean, you know, I can tell you my husband and I had a variety of doctor's appointments that are being postponed. They're fairly routine. We're not worried about them. But those are also sources of reports. And parents who see another parent committing abuse may not know. I mean, one of the issues I have about shelters, for example, is some areas are overwhelmed. Other areas have space. My guess is people who are victims of abuse have no idea which area they're in. And it's not urban areas are overwhelmed and rural areas aren't. That's not true at all. And so the information is really important. The other thing about child abuse, again, it depends how serious it is. With two parents present all the time, I can tell you the tensions of one of the reasons my husband and I have been talking about this, because we were just visiting we just visited our three children, two of whom have children in the household. And the tensions of having the children home full time for one of the family with foster children have been quite intense, in part because the children who seem to have adjusted pretty well are now working through some of their own psychological issues from the trauma associated with childcare, with foster care, as a result of having their routines disrupted. So they continued to go to their old school, they continued to see other family members, and now all of that is cut off and they're spending 24/7 with their foster parents. And the psychological issues involved in that are really different from the psychological issues they were dealing with before, including more acting out, more incidents of the children initiating, I mean, not terrible violence, but hitting each other and getting into fights and, suggesting various issues related to depression. And that question, how do you respond to that? Where do you go? If the therapist you were provided by the county only appears on a TV screen and that doesn't work, now what? I think those are issues we're trying to figure out. So what's the response? I think we need to identify the patterns. How is this different? I think that's really important. Where is the greatest need? I think for everything involving resources right now, we're seeing a system of triage. And, let's face it, who's getting bailed out? The people with the most resources. Who are not being bailed out? The people who don't know how to navigate the system. And when you look at families most at risk, they're going to be in that latter category. And you don't have as much of the intervention of professionals who ordinarily structure these interventions as you would before the virus. So we need to figure out, how do we make more resources available? Change I'd like to see is I'd like to see them more within the control of the reporting parties. So child abuse reporting that's triggered by a professional is often not within the control of the person who brings it to the attention of the professional. With the sheltering in place, you're more likely to see cases reported by parents, and they may be more serious cases. We don't know that.
Professor, you had mentioned, you talked about increasing the resources to hotlines or shelters, and even during this situation, how shelters had to adapt by increasing the distance between their, beds or private shelter rooms. In addition to providing more resources to, say, hotlines and shelters, what other additional services can state and local governments or other service organizations provide for these people at risk? The motivation behind this question is, Congress recently passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, CARES Act, and it was over a $2 trillion bill, and Congress had committed a mere $45 million for abuse shelters and programming, anticipating a spike in domestic violence, but comes to around 0.0023% of the entire budget. Is that enough, or during these unprecedented times, what kind of barometer or yardstick do we use to measure if it's appropriate, if not, how to ramp up that funding?
Well, you have to start with the fact that we have had this 40-year movement to starve the beast. That means to dramatically cut back or eliminate funding for anything that involves social services. And right now what's taking place with the post office is a very clear example of that. So, I used to think post office, who's against the post office? You can debate different ways of organizing the post office, but who's against the post office? And it turns out there's some very powerful interests that want to get rid of the post office. And the way they do it is the same way they deal with domestic violence funds. First, you starve it of funding. Secondly, you say the post office can't compete with private parties. Why? Because the lobbyists who want to kill the post office are, Federal Express and other private entities. Then you say, I was at the post office once on a Friday afternoon, and there was a long line, and there were two minority women who were staffing it. One went in the back, and this older, well-dressed gentleman started railing about how incompetent they were. And I thought the comments were not overtly racist, but I thought the subtext was racist. But I also thought this is the kind of entitled guy who thinks government workers are lazy and he doesn't want his tax money going to them. Well, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You starve people of good jobs. I mean, We don't enforce. What happened with Walmart, by the way, is the Bush administration, which took a ton of money in the way of campaign contributions, gutted the enforcement of wages and hours laws. In fact, they hired Walmart's union buster to head the wages and hours division of the Labor Department in 2006. That's how bad the Bush administration was on this, okay? So you squeeze people who are then worse off, and they do behave more badly, by the way, when you don't pay people and they're worse off, and then you blame them. And then you say we shouldn't give them any money to help them out because it's their fault. After all, why spend all this money on hotlines? Let's put these people in jail. And that's, by the way, nonsensical. It costs a lot more money to put people in jail. But you've got that mindset. And you see it in the congressional negotiations. Mitch McConnell wanted to bail out people who can easily borrow money. And he held up this whole recovery because he didn't want to provide money to frontline hospitals, to healthcare, to hotlines. You have a set of forces in Congress who either believe this is a matter of ideology or who are being, handsomely rewarded by lobbyists in their political campaigns for a mindset that says we want to starve the public sector. Now, if I were to say, how are we going to address domestic violence? I think we should be asking questions like, first of all, you want to ease the level of financial anxiety for these families. That's number one. If you had more money going directly to maintain households, that would cut down on domestic violence, even with sheltering in place. Reducing those kinds of tensions matter. Secondly, you want job guarantees. You want to make sure that people aren't losing their jobs, or if these are the kind of temporary jobs anyway, that they have a job to go back to when this is over. But if you are able to provide support in a way that provides a cushion, that could help. Now, given the nature of sheltering in place, I think providing childcare right now is not going to work. I think that's hard, but increasing, the resources for families. I'm not talking about after there's an incident of domestic violence. I'm starting with resources that start before there is an incident of domestic violence. That might help. So right now, I think hotline resources and sheltering resources are great. I would like to see a lot more interventions earlier. And, some of the things that we may look back at, we may have a baby boom lift in 9 months. I don't know about that. We did with the blackout back in my youth. But we might also find that the level of trauma in adults by children who live through this period in poor families increases. I'm deeply worried about that. And that would trigger a new round of domestic violence, incidents of domestic violence, 20 or 30 years from now. So asking questions about how we can provide more support for families with children to relieve the inevitable tensions. I can tell you, when my first child was born, his idea was, he stopped sleeping most of the day at 3 weeks. He started sleeping through the night at 7 years. He dumped his nap by 2.5, and as long as he was awake, his bedtime was 11 p.m. and as long as he was awake, he was full-time plus. When I went back to work in my lawyer job, I'd go in Monday morning, close the door, and go, oh, peace and quiet. And so I have this enormous sympathy for families all of a sudden taking on full-time childcare when they're not used to it. I'll tell you, for my daughter, having her husband home on a full-time basis, even though he's working from the house, is actually more help than she had before. But for other families, having everybody present in small spaces is really hard. And I do think in crowded urban areas, we need to figure out what's safe for people to get out of the house. I mean, I live in an area where I can go jogging, I can go biking, and I can pick routes where I don't see that many people. But I think for people in dense urban areas, I think this sheer being on top of each other is a huge issue and one we need to figure out protocols to deal with.
Thanks. Speaking a little more to some of the economic and labor force divisions that are going on with the pandemic, we're seeing that like about a third of women are in what are deemed essential positions, and non-white women especially are the most likely to be in these positions. A lot of them like care-oriented jobs that are typically kind of gendered already. So do you foresee in the future that now that we're realizing how essential some of these jobs are, that we'll start viewing them and compensating them accordingly? Or do you see these divisions being more ingrained in that and continuing?
Yeah, it's when's the revolution coming? I actually see on a serious level, I mean, I see the Reagan Revolution that started in 1980 as having run its course. And the Reagan Revolution was basically, you know, to attack tax and spend liberals, to attack the public sector, to associate the private sector with efficiency and productivity. And I think we're ripe for a paradigm shift, not a Bernie revolution, but a paradigm shift that takes the public sector more seriously. But I don't think we're anywhere close to being able to engineer that. So what you described, part of that is about healthcare. So right now, I mean, I tell my daughter this and my son this all the time. The younger two, the ones who aren't lawyers, look, you know, if you want to help people, you can be on the healthcare side or you can be on the teaching side. The teaching side has been starved for funds. The healthcare side hasn't been, because it's a joke. I mean, it's the biggest tax subsidy in the entire federal budget, on the order of $750 billion, is the tax subsidy for private healthcare insurance. And so when you have Sarah Palin talk about getting the government out of my Medicare, where you have people fighting for their private health insurance plans, they're not private plans. They're heavily subsidized by the government through the tax system. And though that healthcare system is dramatically more expensive than any comparable healthcare system in the world, because of the way it's structured, so that doctors' incomes are protected, insurance company profits are protected. But the affordability of healthcare is not. And in particular, the affordability of healthcare is not for people who don't have health insurance. So one of the biggest ripoffs in the entire economy is your insurance company negotiates healthcare rates with the doctors and providers. But if you get the exact same treatment without insurance, you're likely to pay 3 times as much as the insurance company is to pay for the same treatment. Now, what you pay out of pocket is a fraction of that. But I'm saying the insurance companies negotiate rates. The individual cannot. And so what you end up with is people without insurance pay more for the same procedure than somebody who has insurance. But somebody who has insurance is getting a massive subsidy, not just on the amount they pay the doctor. That's the subsidy for the insurance company. They're getting a tax subsidy that helps defer the cost. And all of that means that the base price goes up without affordability for people without insurance increasing. So it's a massive, perverse subsidization of well-off people, often at the expense of poorer people. Now, the good news, the good news, the insurance formularies that go for reimbursement create new jobs. And they create, let's replace the doctor who's a high cost. Let's have doctors spend their time doing high cost procedures. Let's get nurses to do the next layer of skilled procedures. Then let's get physicians' assistants to do the layer after that. The more you break these down into pieces, the more efficient they become in terms of costing less. But they also create new jobs that are easier to get than becoming a doctor. And those new jobs are good jobs. And so healthcare, through this private-public partnership, is a perverse form of socialism. I mean, it's entirely a creation of the federal government. And it's a form of crony capitalism. There are certain interests like insurance companies and doctors who are protected. But it is also a system where it has created a lot of secure jobs that you get by getting a degree. And there's a whole lot more money in healthcare than in education. Education at any level except maybe law schools. But we won't talk about law schools. we will talk, which have been privatized and are less affordable as a result, but still pay well. But when you then look at healthcare and you talk about who are the frontline workers, why are the frontline workers overwhelmingly women and overwhelmingly minority women? Because these are good jobs compared to the other jobs these women have available. There is less discrimination in hiring for these jobs than in being a Walmart manager. It is much more lockstep. You get the right degree, you can get hired. We really need these women, especially in large urban hospitals. The worst jobs, which are the home healthcare aid jobs, are jobs that Native born Americans are less likely to do. They're overwhelmingly immigrant women, especially on the coasts, in the home healthcare aid. And indeed, there are a number of men too, because those jobs with some degree of public subsidization have become better jobs than, working in the fields, better jobs than unskilled labor. Being a home healthcare aid is often better than being a housekeeper, especially if you're working for a cleaning crew as opposed to managing your own business. So what you see is those jobs are a product of a system that in fact puts a huge amount of public subsidization into the healthcare system, and it does create good jobs. Now, if you want to look at rural areas, what is the biggest source of new jobs in the last 10 years? Obamacare. Obamacare, especially in the states that embraced Medicaid expansion, protected rural hospitals and created new jobs in rural areas. And those jobs overwhelmingly go to women. Again, the doctors, I won't say anything about doctors have some of the greatest income disparities on the basis of gender in the economy. But all those intermediate level jobs are heavily female, and they're good jobs in comparison to the jobs such women have available in other sectors of the economy. So when you say, why are the frontline healthcare workers overwhelmingly women? It is because we have a massive subsidy of the healthcare system in general, creating better jobs than the jobs available for those workers in other parts of the economy. And with the coronavirus hitting, they are incredibly vulnerable because even if they are better jobs than comparable jobs available elsewhere for the same people, they're not necessarily jobs with the best protections or the best working environments. And so they are enormously vulnerable, and the people who do those jobs are enormously motivated by the desire to care for people. So our health, the frontline healthline workers deserve our thanks, and they deserve more protection than they're getting.
We started this interview with domestic violence, and we talked about a lot of other issues related to gender, and this turned out to be a wide-ranging, wide-covering interview. In the midst of all this, what do you think gives you hope coming out of this pandemic? What are some silver linings, that hopeful moments that you see?
Well, I hope one of the things that we should be discovering is that we need government. I mean, we need community. We need a public sector. And, I actually, on these things, can be agnostic about whether private sector institutions like charities and churches can do a lot of work to help people. But you can't have churches and volunteers replace hospital systems. And you can't have my local listserv, there's a guy who wanted to get us started talking about how to reopen. And, he started thinking about, well, should we have restaurants that are 50% open and, a variety of other things that, I'm happy to talk about. But I don't have any expertise in this. He doesn't have any expertise in this. We need a public health service that, provides data for us. And so I hope if there's anything that comes out of this, it's a sense we're in this together. I can be infected by somebody I like or somebody I dislike just as easily. If we don't have a sense we're related to each other, and that we need and also that not just we need more resources in the public sector, because you know, if poor people get sick, they're going to infect us too. So again, that sense of we're in it together as opposed to it's their fault, they're poor, and if they die from coronavirus, I don't care. You know, you are hearing from some sources, it's mostly about old people. My husband and I are now old enough to realize, you know, it is among the startling things about this, I do not think of myself as old. I think of myself as young and healthy. And reading some of these things and risk categories, realizing, oh, that is my age range. That was startling. But I think that underscores the point that we are vulnerable to, because of what happens to the least among us. This is not a matter of, oh, you know, I go jogging regularly, I'm healthier than you are, and therefore I'm going to survive this, and it's your fault you die. I'm sorry, pandemics work. So I'm hoping that we come to a greater appreciation that we're connected to each other, we need each other, and that we really do a whole lot better job where it's based, you know, the United States used to pride itself compared to European countries being pragmatic as opposed to ideological. But we are now ideological. And I will tell you, I mean, I feel this way. I've taught at a number of different schools. I've taught at, I started teaching at George Mason, hotbed of law and economics. I then went to a very liberal school and was delighted to be there the first 10 years I was there. And the second 10 years, really, you know, the ideology of the left can be as destructive as the ideology of the right when it puts the cause ahead of how the institution works and taking the people who feel responsibility as a professional. For me, that comes first. And so I hope from this, we start looking at facts. You know, we're very soon going to have an empirical test of who controls the virus and who doesn't. And I hope that we learn from it, that maybe we need to learn to listen to people who have information. You know, I'd prefer to listen to Dr. Anthony Fauci than most governors. I do think he knows what he's talking about. And so that's my hope. You know, I think lawyers would benefit from a system that paid more attention to the rule of law and expertise instead of, I think, right, you know, one of the problems for lawyers right now is K Street. Lobbying is a whole lot more powerful than the big law firms who tell you you can't do things. You're better off hiring lawyers who will influence Congress to just change the law than the lawyers who tell you how to comply with the law. So I think that too is about expertise as opposed to power. It's not what you can get away with, it's how can we make the world better. And I am hopeful. I am hopeful there will be a bigger constituency.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time this evening, going through these questions with us. I hope you and your family are staying safe in all of this. I don't know if you have any final thoughts as we head out.
Well, I hope people are taking care of themselves and the people they're close to. And I think that's what's going to get us through this.
Thanks.
So much, Professor. We are incredibly glad that you were the first legal expert that we kicked off this series with. And again, you know, echoing what Abby said, thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. Good questions and provocative ones.